Imagine looking for an apartment, right? Like in a really competitive, expensive city.
Oh, yeah. A nightmare.
Right, a total nightmare. So you do your research, you check all the listings, and you see that a pretty standard, nice place goes for about $2,300 a month on the open market.
Which is steep, but I mean, that's the going rate these days.
Exactly, it's the going rate. But then you meet a neighbor who lives in your exact same building. They have the exact same floor plan, the same view, everything. And they tell you they only pay $135 a month.
Oh, wait, 135 total.
Total. And here's the kicker. The landlord isn't legally allowed to change their rent, ever.
That's quite a deal.
Right, because this neighbor, they signed a lease that was handed down from their grandparents. And the rules were basically locked in place decades ago. So they pay $135, and you would have to pay $2,300. It sounds like this insane, impossible real estate loophole that just couldn't possibly exist in the modern economy.
It does sound completely like fiction, but, we aren't actually talking about urban real estate today.
No, we are not.
We are talking about the American West. Specifically, we're talking about the cost of grazing private livestock on federal public lands.
Exactly. And on the table today, we have this massive stack of sources for our deep dive. I mean, we're looking at the Taylor Grazing Act of 1934. We've got federal statutes like FLPMA and PRIA, internal policy memos from the Bureau of Land Management, and these really thorough, nonpartisan financial analyses from the Government Accountability Office and the Congressional Research Service.
It's a lot of paper. But the story hidden inside all those dry legal statutes is, well, it's really a masterclass in how government policy evolves, or actually, in this case, how it completely refuses to evolve.
Yeah, that's the perfect way to phrase it, because the mission of this deep dive today is to figure out how a genuine emergency law from 1934-like, a law designed to save the dying open range of the West from just total ecological collapse, somehow morphed into this permanent, highly subsidized system that is completely locked in place by a pricing formula from 1978.
Right. We are going to look at the math, the history, and the very real human and economic factors that make this grazing system just almost impossible to change. And I want to be really clear up front for everyone listening, the tension here isn't a simple narrative of good guys versus bad guys.
Definitely not.
There are no villains here. The real tension is institutional inertia.
Yeah, and to really wrap your head around why the federal government essentially gives away public forage today, we have to start with the utter lawless chaos of the late 19th century. Because back then, that forage was completely free, and the land was, literally dying as a result.
We do need to rewind. So if we look at the period between, say, the 1860s and the early 1900s, the unreserved public domain of the American West was completely open.
It's wide open.
Exactly. There were no fences at all. There were no permits. There were absolutely no limits on who could run cattle or sheep or even how many they could run.
But the government did try to get rid of this land, right? Like they wanted to privatize.
Yeah.
Because I was reading about the 1916 Stock Raising Homestead Act in the sources, and that was this massive attempt to transfer these vast arid landscapes into private hands.
Right. The idea was to encourage settlement. They were basically giving people 640-acre parcels to farm and raise stock.
But it largely failed because you just cannot farm a desert. 640 acres in Ohio might make you a really wealthy, successful farmer, but 640 acres in Nevada won't even keep a small herd of cattle alive through the winter.
No, the carrying capacity of the land was just way too low. The land was simply too dry to support any kind of traditional homestead agriculture. So because of that, millions of acres just remained in the federal public domain, operating as this completely unmanaged open range.
And this era, it perfectly illustrates the economic theory known as the tragedy of the commons. I really want to spend some time on this, because understanding the incentive structure of the 1890s is literally the only way the 1934 laws make any sense at all.
It's the core of the whole issue.
Right. And you usually hear the tragedy of the commons compared to like a messy shared office refrigerator where no one cleans it out. But looking at the historical accounts of these massive cattle booms in our sources, it feels so much more severe than that.
Oh, absolutely.
It operates more like a joint bank account where everyone in town has a debit card, nobody is required to make any deposits, and there's absolutely no overdraft limit.
That is a much, much more accurate mechanism. If you were a rancher operating on the open public domain in, say, 1890, you did not own the grass.
Right.
You had no legal mechanism whatsoever to exclude anyone else from it. So if you decided to be a careful steward of the land, like, say, you held your herd back to let a specific valley rest, to let the perennial grasses actually drop their seed, you weren't saving that grass for next year.
No, you were just leaving it for someone else.
Exactly. You were simply leaving it for a transient sheep operator or a competing cattle outfit to come in and just devour the next morning.
So the economic math is just brutal. Restraint is actively punished. The only rational move for an individual operator is to extract the resource as aggressively as possible before someone else does.
Overstarking was heavily, heavily rewarded in the short term. But the physical toll on the landscape was just devastating. I mean, we are talking about an arid ecosystem that evolved with migratory bison.
Right, and bison move constantly.
Exactly. They would graze an area intensely, sure, but then they wouldn't return for years. The ecosystem was simply not built for the relentless, year-round pressure of concentrated stationary domestic livestock.
The ecological mechanics of this are so fascinating and honestly really grim. The native perennial bunch grasses, they have these incredibly deep root systems that hold the arid soil together, but they were grazed down to the absolute dirt.
And because they never got a chance to rest and actually go to seed, they just died off.
Yeah. And then they were replaced by these shallow-rooted invasive weeds like cheatgrass and woody shrubs like sagebrush.
And without those deep root systems holding the soil together, the hydrology of the West began to change completely. When it did rain, the water no longer soaked into a spongy, vegetated landscape.
It just sheeted off.
Right, it sheeted off the bare soil, carving these incredibly deep, erosive gullies into the hillsides. The land literally lost its capacity to retain moisture.
Which perfectly sets the stage for a localized apocalypse when the weather inevitably turns. Because when I was looking at the agricultural data from the 1930s, the intersection of this heavily degraded landscape and the historic drought was just catastrophic.
It was. And actually, I'm really glad you brought up the 1930s drought, because there is this important historical nuance we need to untangle regarding the Dust Bowl.
Oh, right. Let's clarify that, because it's really easy to just conflate the entire environmental disaster of the 30s into one single monolithic event.
Yeah.
But the sources are very careful to distinguish between the Great Plains and the Western rangelands.
They are. The most iconic apocalyptic dust storms of 1934 and 1935, the black blizzards that literally blotted out the sun in places like Oklahoma and Kansas, those primarily originated from plowed-up farmland on the Great Plains.
Right, that was sod that had been intentionally busted for intensive wheat farming.
Exactly, and then it just pulverized into dust when the rain stopped. That was not primarily caused by livestock grazing on the arid western range.
But having said that, the rangelands were not innocent bystanders either. I mean, even if they weren't the primary source of the cinematic black blizzards, the overgrazed western public domain was rapidly turning into a wasteland. The land had been mined of its natural capital for, 50 years?
At least 50 years, yeah. And by the spring of 1934, the situation had just reached a boiling point, both physically and politically.
Because the dust literally reached Washington.
It did. In April 1934, the physical reality of western soil erosion landed directly on the desks of politicians in D.C. Dust from the degraded West blew all the way across the continent and settled on the Capitol building. It created the ultimate political pressure cooker. The open range was just undeniably an economic and ecological disaster.
So the complete failure of the open commons was just staring Congress in the face. The government realized they had to build a gate. The era of free-for-all access had to end, which brings us to the really interesting political maneuvering of 1933 and 1934.
Right. So set the scene. We are in the absolute depths of the Great Depression. The cattle industry is facing total collapse due to the drought and just plunging market prices. And there's a congressman from Colorado named Edward T. Taylor.
Who had actually opposed federal regulation for years, right?
He had. He was staunchly against it. But he finally realizes that without intervention, the range will be destroyed permanently. So he reintroduces a grazing bill, and on June 28, 1934, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signs the Taylor Grazing Act into law.
And this act authorized the Secretary of the Interior to take up to 80 million acres of the unreserved public domain, which they quickly amended to 142 million acres in 1936, just a massive amount of land, and organize it into formal grazing districts.
For the very first time, ranchers would actually need a legal permit, valid for up to 10 years, to run their livestock on this land, and they would have to pay a fee.
Now, this is where we need to look really closely at the statutory text of the Taylor Grazing Act, because the legislative intent of this specific law basically dictates everything that happens for the next 90 years.
It really does.
Because when I first read about this, I immediately questioned the fee structure.
Right.
I mean, it's 1934. The federal government is desperately trying to fund all these New Deal programs, and they are sitting on 142 million acres of land. Why wouldn't they charge a fair market price for this grass? It just seems like a massive missed opportunity for federal revenue.
Well, it certainly would have been if revenue was actually the goal, but the statutory text of the Taylor Grazing Act explicitly outlines a completely different purpose.
Right.
The law specifically states it is meant to, quote, stop injury to the public grazing lands by preventing overgrazing and soil deterioration, and to provide for their orderly use, improvement, and development. But most importantly, and this is the key, it was meant to stabilize the livestock industry dependent upon the public range.
Okay, so it was fundamentally a rescue operation.
Exactly. If they had charged a high market rate in 1934, they would have instantly bankrupted the very industry they were legally mandated to stabilize.
That makes total sense. So the initial fee was nominal. It was only meant to sort of ration the use of the land, maybe fund the bare minimum of administrative costs, and perhaps pay for some really basic range improvements, like water tanks.
Yes. But, declaring a law in a building in Washington, D.C., and actually enforcing it across 142 million acres of rugged, remote western desert, those are two very, very different things.
Oh, the logistics of this are just staggering to think about. I mean, Secretary of the Interior Harold Ickes had to create a brand new bureaucracy, the Division of Grazing, just to implement this thing.
And the way they chose to implement it really explains the modern power dynamic perfectly. Ickes chose a man named Farrington R. Carpenter to be the first director of the Division of Grazing.
And Carpenter was a really fascinating figure, right? He was a rancher and a lawyer from Colorado.
He was. He understood the Western mindset intimately. He knew, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that if a bunch of federal bureaucrats from the East Coast showed up in places like Nevada or Wyoming and just started dictating severe grazing cuts, the ranchers would simply rebel.
Yeah, it would have chaos.
Total chaos. Plus, the new agency had virtually no budget and this massive, unprecedented mandate.
I was looking at Carpenter's administrative solution, and it is honestly a masterclass in pragmatic delegation. He built the entire management system around local advisory boards. He basically went to the local stockmen and said, look, you guys know the land, you know who has been running cattle out here for decades, you figure out the boundaries, and you figure out who gets the permits.
Exactly. The local ranchers themselves literally sat on these advisory boards. They were officially tasked with adjudicating grazing privileges based on two things. Prior use, meaning who had historically used the range and base property, which basically meant you needed to own a private ranch with water to even qualify for a federal permit.
Which conveniently allowed the established property-owning cattlemen to completely freeze out the transient landless sheep herders who had been directly competing with them for decades.
It certainly did, but if we zoom out, the mechanics of these local advisory boards represent a massive structural compromise by the government.
Oh, huge. I mean, it was a stroke of political genius in the short term, sure.
Yeah.
It made an impossible administrative task actually workable on the ground.
And it made the Taylor Grazing Act durable because the ranchers felt they were governing themselves. But the long-term mechanism is what legal and economic scholars call regulatory capture.
Right. The regulated became the regulators.
Yeah.
By giving the local permittees the power to draw the lines and set the carrying capacity, Carpenter fundamentally hardwired the livestock industry's economic interests directly into the federal regulatory agency from day one.
Now, to be fair, the Taylor Grazing Act did succeed in its primary ecological goal. It successfully fenced in the tragedy of the commons.
The bleeding stopped.
Exactly. The unregulated, relentless overstocking stopped. Slowly, the Western range began to stabilize. But because the agency was so deeply intertwined with the industry it regulated, this temporary emergency fix began to calcify.
And we see the calcification happen pretty quickly, because the Division of Grazing eventually morphs into the Grazing Service. And looking at the congressional records from the 1940s in our sources, this agency was just a political punching bag.
Oh, they were chronically underfunded.
Constantly. Whenever the agency leadership tried to raise the grazing fee even a few pennies to just cover their basic operational costs, the ranchers would use their political leverage through those local advisory boards to pressure their Western congressmen.
And in several documented instances, Congress deliberately slashed the Grazing Service's budget specifically to punish them for attempting to raise fees.
It's wild. the agency was kept intentionally weak. Finally, in 1946, the federal government does a massive reorganization. They merged this embattled grazing service with the much older General Land Office to form the Bureau of Land Management, or the BLM.
And for anyone living in the West today, the BLM is just a ubiquitous presence. They manage the vast majority of the open rangeland, while the Forest Service runs a parallel grazing system up in the timbered mountains.
Right. But even after the BLM was formed in 1946, there was still this massive legal ambiguity hanging over the entire system, wasn't there?
There was, because for over a century, the overarching philosophy of the United States government regarding the public domain was disposal.
Disposal, meaning get rid of it.
Exactly. The government believed it was simply a temporary custodian of the land. Through all the various land grants, railroad grants, and homestead acts, the ultimate goal was always to eventually transfer all of it into private hands or cede it to the states.
So if I'm a rancher holding a 10-year BLM grazing permit in, say, 1960, I am still operating under the fundamental assumption that eventually this land is going to be disposed of.
Yes. But then, in 1976, Congress completely pulls the plug on the disposal era. They passed the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, usually called FLPMA.
And FLPMA represents a seismic philosophical and legal shift in American history. Because with FLPMA, Congress officially declared that the federal government was going to retain these public lands in federal ownership forever.
They are keeping the desert.
Keeping it permanently.
Not only keeping it, but managing it under a brand new statutory mandate called multiple use. Prior to 1976, the BLM lands were effectively managed as a massive single-use livestock pasture with some mining thrown in.
Right.
But FLPMA declared that these lands must be managed for a variety of overlapping uses: recreation, wildlife habitat, watershed protection, wilderness preservation, and yes, livestock grazing.
And that transition from a temporary pasture to a permanent multiple-use landscape changes the psychology of the grazing permit entirely, doesn't it?
Oh, completely.
If I'm a rancher, and my grandfather got a temporary permit in 1934 just to stabilize his herd on land the government eventually planned to sell, well, that is one thing. But in 1976, the government says they're keeping the land forever, and grazing is legally codified as one of its permanent uses.
Right. The temporary stewardship arrangement basically calcifies into a permanent right of access in the minds of the permittees. The land is secured. And once a business secures its access to the essential resource, the very next priority is locking in the overhead costs.
Which brings us to the absolute core of the modern debate, the math. How did the livestock industry actually manage to legally freeze their rent?
They accomplished it through the 1978 Public Rangelands Improvement Act, which is known as PIA. PIA established a very specific statutory formula for calculating the federal grazing fee.
And this is the formula that was extended by an executive order in 1986, right?
Yes, and it has dictated the price of federal glass every single year since.
Okay, before we dig into the specific variables of the PRIA formula, we really need to establish exactly what a rancher is purchasing. Because they aren't just renting acres of land. You can't just lease 1,000 acres, because 1,000 acres in a lush mountain valley is, well, it's very different from 1,000 acres in the Nevada scrub.
Exactly. They are buying units of forage, specifically an AUM, or animal unit month.
The sources define an AUM as the amount of forage, the actual physical grass and vegetation, needed to sustain one cow and her calf, or one horse or 5 sheep, for exactly 1 month.
That's right.
So when we talk about the grazing fee, we're talking about the price of one single AUM.
And the PRA formula calculates the cost of that AUM using a highly rigid structure. It begins with a base value that was established way back in 1966.
Okay.
It then adjusts that 1966 base annually using 2 specific indices: an index of current beef cattle prices and an index of current ranching production costs.
You know, in theory, the logic seems somewhat fair. Like, if cattle prices soar and ranchers are making record profits, the fee goes up. If the cost of diesel, hay, and labor spikes, the fee goes down to give the ranchers a break.
In theory, yes.
But the actual mechanics of the formula have 2 massive structural constraints built in by Congress that just completely insulate the fee from the real-world market.
First, the formula has a hard statutory floor. Congress mandated that the fee can never drop below $1.35 per AUM.
So $1.35 is the absolute basement. It cannot go lower.
Correct. Second, PRIA imposes a strict speed limit on the formula. The fee is legally prohibited from increasing or decreasing by more than 25% in any single year, regardless of what the broader economic indices are doing.
Wow. It's literally a mathematical straitjacket.
Oh,
It has a floor it cannot fall through and a cap that prevents it from ever catching up to modern inflation.
Let's look at the modern numbers to see the actual result of that formula over time.
The figures are just staggering. In the 2025 growing year, which runs from March 1st, 2025 to February 28, 2026, the federal grazing fee hit that absolute statutory floor. It was $1.35 per AUM.
The absolute basement.
Right. Then, for the 2026 grazing year, the formula indices finally triggered an increase, so it took the maximum 25% jump allowed by law. Effective March 1st, 2026, the fee rises to $1.69 per AUM. And that price applies to roughly 18,000 BLM permits and about 5,550 Forest Service permits across the entire West.
$1.69 to feed a 1,000-pound animal and her calf for an entire month.
It's hard to even process. Now compare that engineered price to the reality of the private market. Because according to the USDA National Agricultural Statistics Service, the average private grazing lease rate across 17 western states in 2024 was roughly $23.40 per AUM.
Let that sink in.
$23.40 compared to $1.69. The federal fee is currently sitting somewhere between 13 to 17 times below the regional private market rate. It is a financial canyon. Even if you completely abandoned the PRIA formula and just adjusted that original 1966 base fee for standard inflation, it should be sitting around $7 or $8 in AUM today.
And this canyon between the formula and reality creates a severe compounding structural deficit for the American taxpayer. Because managing 142 million acres of multiple-use land in the 21st century requires a massive, massive apparatus.
It does. I was looking at the data from the Government Accountability Office, the nonpartisan investigative arm of Congress. And their most comprehensive dive into these specific program costs is from fiscal year 2004.
Right, and while the exact dollar amounts have naturally shifted with inflation over the last 20 years, budget watchdogs like Taxpayers for Common Sense confirm that the structural math remains identical today. The ratios haven't changed at all.
The mechanics of that GAO report are incredibly illuminating. They analyzed literally everything it takes for the BLM and the Forest Service to administer the grazing program.
And what did they find?
The GAO found that in 2004, the agency spent at least $144 million administering grazing. And when you look at what that entails, it isn't just, printing paper permits. It is paying rangeland scientists to monitor soil health.
It's conducting massive environmental impact statements under NEPA.
Yes. It is managing the endless legal battles over endangered species. It is driving trucks out to incredibly remote allotments just to ensure compliance.
So a $144 million outlay. And in return, how much did the federal government actually collect in grazing fees from the permittees that year?
Approximately $21 million.
Wow.
Yeah. That is a net cost to taxpayers of over $120 million a year simply to administer the system. The government literally loses money every single time it issues a grazing permit. The fee doesn't even cover the administrative overhead, let alone reflect the actual market value of the forage.
Looking at that $120 million black hole, the immediate, obvious logical question is why Congress doesn't simply abolish the PRIA formula and raise the price to $23 tomorrow.
Exactly. It seems so obvious. You have a private business operating on public land, generating a 9-figure deficit for the taxpayer. Why not just charge the market rate?
It seems simple.
But, and this is crucial, it's easy to look at that spreadsheet and just point the finger at the ranchers. If you actually put yourself in their boots and look at their balance sheets, you realize their defense isn't just political spin. It is rooted in raw, unforgiving economic survival.
Right. To really understand why the system is so highly calcified, we have to look very closely at the mechanisms of the permittee's defense. And the first major point is that a direct apples-to-apples comparison between the $1.69 federal fee and the $23.40 private fee is fundamentally flawed.
The sources make a really compelling case here. I actually think about it like renting a car.
Okay, how so?
If I rent a car from a private agency for $50 a day, I expect it to have an engine, tires, and a full tank of gas. If it breaks down on the highway, I expect the rental company to send a tow truck.
Right, that's what you're paying for.
Exactly. And that is analogous to a private grazing lease. The $23.40 market rate often includes functioning fences, developed water sources, and the landowner actually checking on the cattle.
But a federal grazing permit is entirely different. The federal government is basically renting you a chassis without an engine. The $1.69 only buys the bare vegetation, nothing else.
The bring your own engine lease.
That's exactly what it is. When a rancher operates on a BLM allotment, they bear immense out-of-pocket costs to make that land even usable. The federal government does not water the cows. The rancher has to pay to drill the wells, lay miles of pipeline, and install the solar pumps and troughs.
And they have to supply the labor to build and maintain the fencing across miles of rugged terrain. They have to blade the dirt access roads.
And the risk profile is entirely on the rancher. If a mountain lion takes down 3 calves or poisonous weeds kill a dozen cows, the rancher absorbs that loss. The federal government does not reimburse them for the hazards of the open range.
So when agricultural economists analyze the true cost of operating on federal lands, they have to add the $1.69 cash fee to all those out-of-pocket maintenance and infrastructure costs. The true cost to the rancher is significantly higher than $1.69.
It is. Now, most independent analyses still conclude that a subsidy exists even after accounting for those costs, but the gap is much narrower than the raw headline numbers suggest.
That makes perfect sense. The cash fee is only a fraction of their operating cost. But the second part of the rancher's defense is the one that really maps out the structural trap the government has built for itself. We have to dive into the banking mechanics of capitalized expectations.
This is perhaps the most crucial financial mechanism in this entire debate, because a federal grazing permit cannot simply be bought and sold on the open market like a stock. By law, it is inextricably tied to a rancher's private property, what they call their base property.
Okay, so if I own a 500-acre ranch in a valley in Wyoming, the permit to graze 2,000 cattle on the adjacent 50,000 acres of BLM land is legally attached to my deeded 500 acres.
Yes. Now, let's walk through the mechanics of a real estate transaction. If you decide to sell that Wyoming ranch, the buyer isn't just appraising the value of your 500 acres of dirt in your barn. They are appraising the value of the entire operation, which inherently includes the access to the massive federal pasture next door.
Oh, I see. Because the federal grass is artificially cheap, it makes the private ranch artificially valuable.
Exactly. Over the last 90 years, the financial value of that subsidized federal forage has been fully absorbed or capitalized into the sale price of the private-based properties. The value of the subsidy literally became the value of the real estate.
Wait, so the government basically accidentally created an invisible asset in 1934, and they just let rural banks treat it like real estate collateral for a century?
That is exactly what happened. Because the PRAA formula is so rigid and the permits are reliably renewed every 10 years, local agricultural banks view federal grazing permits as stable, predictable assets. Lenders routinely use the capitalized value of the federal permit as collateral when they underwrite loans to ranchers. So if a rancher needs a $1 million loan to buy a new fleet of tractors or build a barn or simply survive a multi-year drought, the bank secures that loan against the inflated value of the base property.
If we follow the logic of that mechanism, the implications are terrifying. If the BLM wakes up tomorrow, ignores the PRAA formula, and fixes the math by raising the cash fee to the market rate of $23, they don't just solve a federal budget deficit, they accidentally trigger a regional banking crisis.
The math is entirely unforgiving. If the federal fee suddenly matches the private market, the subsidized margin disappears, and instantly the capitalized value of the private ranch plummets.
And when the property value plummets, the collateral for all those agricultural loans evaporates overnight.
Exactly.
The banks would be forced to call in the loans, the ranchers wouldn't be able to pay them because their equity just vanished, and you would trigger massive defaults across rural communities in the West.
You would wipe out the multi-generational equity of thousands of rural families in a single strike. This is the ultimate institutional trap. The federal government cannot afford to pop the bubble without devastating the exact local economies they set out to stabilize in 1934.
It is a terrifying knot to untangle, and the permittees also argue that beyond just their own financial survival, they are actually providing tangible, landscape-level public goods. They argue the taxpayer is getting a return on their investment through stewardship.
The stewardship argument is very common, and it rests on 3 main pillars. First, ranchers argue that their cattle perform a vital ecological service by reducing fine fuel loads. In an era of catastrophic western wildfires, cattle are actively grazing down the dry, invasive grasses like cheatgrass that act as kindling for these massive megafires.
So they are essentially providing biological fire suppression.
Right. The second pillar involves all that water infrastructure we talked about earlier. The ranchers lay the pipe and pump the water for their cattle, sure, but they point out that native wildlife elk, mule deer, pronghorn antelope heavily rely on those man-made troughs to survive the dry summer months.
That makes sense. And the third and perhaps most resonant argument is about the preservation of open space, isn't it?
Yes, it is. The economics of Western real estate have shifted dramatically in the last few decades. The highest and best financial use of a private ranch with water rights is rarely raising cattle anymore.
It is selling to a developer.
Absolutely. The ranchers argue that they are the primary bulwark against the fragmentation of the West. If you raise grazing fees and bankrupt the livestock operations, those families will be forced to sell their private-based properties. And those properties will be subdivided into luxury resorts, 20-acre ranchettes, and strip malls.
The sweeping, unbroken vistas of the American West will be paved over.
That's their argument, yes.
And those are powerful, mathematically and culturally valid points. I mean, the ranchers, their real out-of-pocket costs, their entire financial equity is hostage to a system they didn't invent, and they do provide certain landscape-level benefits.
They do. But the stalemate occurs when we weigh those realities against the taxpayer's ledger and the ecological reality of the modern era, because the counter-arguments to the permittee's defense are equally robust.
Let's examine the critic's perspective then. Because environmental organizations and taxpayer watchdogs look at those stewardship arguments and point out that the benefits are incredibly uneven.
Right. A meticulously managed rotational grazing operation might reduce fire risk, but a poorly managed operation can devastate the landscape.
Exactly. And cattle naturally congregate around water. If they're left unmanaged in a riparian zone, the lush green areas around creeks and streams, they can trample the banks, destroy fish spawning habitats, and just completely foul the water quality.
Furthermore, critics look at the macroeconomic scale of the program. Public lands grazing supplies only a tiny fraction of the total beef produced in the United States. Estimates usually put it between 2 and 3%. We are not feeding the nation with this system. It is a highly localized economic benefit for a relatively small number of permittees.
And regarding the wildlife benefits, ecologists point out that subsidized stocking levels often place domestic livestock in direct competition with native herbivores. An elk might drink from a cattle trough, but that same elk is competing with the cow for the limited forage in the valley.
But the core contradiction, the thing that synthesizes this entire debate, always comes back to the cash fee.
The Gallardian 69 cents.
Yes. Even if you accept every single stewardship argument the ranchers make, even if you completely agree that cattle suppress fires, wildlife use the water, and ranches preserve open space, none of those arguments explain the mechanism of why the physical cash fee must remain mathematically frozen at a level that generates a massive administrative deficit.
It doesn't explain why the taxpayer has to absorb a $120 million loss just to process the paperwork and send a ranger out to monitor the grass. It is the ultimate case study of privatizing gains and socializing losses.
There really is.
The private operator captures the financial value of the incredibly cheap forage, capitalizing it into their private equity. Meanwhile, the public taxpayer absorbs the foregone rent and foots the bill for the administrative overhead.
And that's why the true takeaway of this deep dive is understanding institutional calcification.
Institutional calcification?
Yes. The Taylor Grazing Act of 1934 was a measured success. It addressed a genuine, terrifying ecological emergency. The open range was blowing away, and the government built a fence. But because of the rigid math of the 1978 PRIA formula, the political entrenchment of the local advisory boards, and 90 years of capitalized property values backed by agricultural banks, a tool meant for temporary stabilization became a permanent, untouchable asset class.
The emergency fix became the permanent architecture of the West. It blows my mind.
It's an incredible story.
Let's quickly recap the mechanics of this journey. We started in the 1890s in a dust-choked, lawless, open range where the tragedy of the commons, that joint bank account with no overdraft limit, was literally destroying the root systems of the earth.
We saw a desperate New Deal intervention in 1934 that fenced the West, but crucially delegated the mapping to local advisory boards, hardwiring industry interests into the bureaucracy.
Right. And we watched as the temporary grazing service limped into the creation of the BLM, and we saw how the 1976 FLPMA law accidentally transformed temporary permits into permanent fixtures by declaring the federal government would retain the land forever.
And finally, we arrived at the modern stalemate, a rigid 1978 pricing formula that artificially insulates the fee from reality, creating a canyon between the $1.69 public price and the $23.40 private value. A system where raising the fee to cover the taxpayer's $120 million administrative deficit risks, triggering a regional banking collapse because the subsidy has been baked into private real estate values for a century.
And this matters directly to anyone listening, because if you are a citizen, you are a shareholder in those 142 million acres of BLM land. Your taxpayer dollars fund that administrative deficit. Understanding the mechanics of the system forces you to ask hard questions about government policy. How long is a temporary government fix allowed to persist once an entire industry builds its financial survival around it?
It is a profound puzzle of policy inertia.
I want to leave you with one final, provocative thought to mull over. Something that builds on the statutory history we've discussed, but reframes the entire modern debate. Think back to the statutory text of 1934. The Taylor Grazing Act was designed solely to stabilize the livestock industry and stop soil erosion. That was its mandate. But remember what happened in 1976 with the FLPMA law?
Congress shifted the mandate to multiple use management.
Exactly. In 1976, the law declared that these public lands are legally mandated to be managed for a multitude of overlapping uses. They are no longer just pastures. They must be managed for recreation, for hikers, for hunters, for watershed conservation, and for wildlife habitat right alongside livestock.
Right.
So here's the question to ponder. If the legal and cultural purpose of the public domain has evolved over the last 50 years to serve everyone, the hikers, the hunters, the wildlife, and the ranchers alike, why is the pricing structure still locked in a 1930s mindset designed to save a single industry? If the land is no longer just a pasture, should the rent still be calculated like one?
That tension between historical inertia and modern reality is what defines the American West today.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Uncosted West. Keep digging into the sources, keep asking the hard questions, and the next time you see a cow out on a vast stretch of public sagebrush, you will know exactly the century of law, math, and inertia it took to get her there. We will catch you on the next deep dive.